Okay, so let's have a look at how we should think about the Western Front and what the Western Front has to do with the Anzac legend. Firstly, let's remember where our Western Front is, and you should be able to refer back to some images, some maps that we've used in class on other resources and so on. But the Western Front is really on the western side of Germany. It runs through the areas where the Schlieffen Plan was stopped by trench warfare in 1914. Remember, most of 1914 and 1915 saw Australian troops, the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force, firstly being trained as volunteers in Australia, then in Egypt, where they joined the New Zealanders and became the ANZAC, the ANZAC, the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, and then they went to Gallipoli. After Gallipoli, we need to talk about the Western Front. Now, the Western Front is crucial. Australian troops arrive on the Western Front in 1916 and find themselves very quickly as part of the trench warfare. The trench warfare of the Western Front is highly destructive. You can see in this image that's appeared in 1917, the landscape totally destroyed. Trees stripped of all branches, if trees still stand at all. Duckboards, wooden walkways assembled over mud-filled bomb and shell craters, artillery craters, and these are Australian troops moving around behind the trenches. That's not no man's land, that's behind the trenches of the Western Front. This 1918 photo of the Western Front emphasises the casualties that Australians suffered while on that Western Front area. And this is soldiers at Villers-Bretonneux and their Brisbane-based soldiers. I can tell that by the regimental oval shape on their shoulder flashes, and I know that as my father's uncle's regiment that were raised in Enoggera and fought on the Western Front. They're victims of a gas attack at Villers-Bretonneux in May 1918. And that's where my Uncle Tom Racy, my father's uncle, my grandmother's brother, where he fought and was injured in a gas attack. So it's quite possible he's in that photo, a very special photo to me. Sometimes when we talk about the Western Front, we neglect to mention that it's here, like at Gallipoli, where women also played an important role. Certainly not in the same numbers as troops, but in groups that are not spoken about traditionally when people talk about the Australian World War I experience. So look at this photograph. We can clearly see two Australian nurses tending to the wounded on the Western Front. So we need to remember that on the Western Front, there were many, many people who gave some, and some gave their all. And that's part of our Remembrance Day, part of our oath, or rather ode, that's taken as part of our Anzac Day ceremonies. So we need to remember, we need to bear witness to the contributions of all on the Western Front. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about what actually happened. After Gallipoli, Anzac troops were withdrawn back to Egypt by ship, where they were re-equipped, rested, retrained, and reinforced by more Australian soldiers. And here we can see Australian soldiers riding camels in the shadows, if you like, of the pyramids at Cairo. Now, it was here that they were prepared to be sent to other battlefronts after the failed Gallipoli campaign. At the start of 1916, within a short period of time after coming out of Gallipoli, it was decided where the Australians would go next. And the first group that were the majority of the Australian army that were at Egypt, it was decided they would be sent to the Western Front, near Belgium, or in Belgium and France, okay, where the trench warfare was at worst. And this is a photograph of the AIF infantry near the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is the group of soldiers, or at least a small portion of the group of soldiers, who would go and fight on the Western Front against the Germans after they were re-equipped, retrained and rested. A few R's in there for me to stumble over. The other group of the Australian Army were the light horse regiments. And the light horse regiments were reunited after Gallipoli with their horses, the famous whaler horses, well worth looking for at the Eka when you go to see the horse pavilion. But the large Whaler horses, and they would fight against the Turks again in Palestine and Lebanon, near Egypt, in desert warfare on horseback. So have a look at where this arrow is indicating in our map down below. Not far from Turkey, part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And you can see in the corner of this map I'm indicating now for you where Gallipoli was, where Turkey controlled all of this area. So the light horsemen are on again to fight against the Turks, while the infantry go via England to the Western Front. So there were more than 295,000 Australians who went to the Western Front. Of those, 46,000 lost their lives and 132,000 were wounded. This doesn't include those who also got sick and so on. It doesn't include those who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, what becomes known as shell shock. Of those, 55 Australians were awarded the highest award that can be given for bravery. 55 of them received the Victoria Cross, and that's a massive number. Australia was involved in approximately 29 major battles on the Western Front between their arrival there in 1916 and armistice in November 1918. Only a handful of those battles are well known, and here are photos of some of them and the names of some of them. When we went to Anzac Square, we looked up into the Shrine of Remembrance above the Eternal Flame, and many of these battles are named up the top. Fromelles, the Somme, the River Somme Valley, Bullecourt, Messines, Passchendaele, and the very, very famous Villers-Bretonneux. And Villers-Bretonneux is remembered on Anzac Day because it was Anzac Day 1918 where some of the fighting there was at its most intense. When we think about the Western Front, and as you study the Western Front, it's worth bearing in mind that even Charles Bean, the creator, if you like, of the Anzac legend, argued that the Anzac achievements on the Western Front were never fully recognised by Australians back home. They were in the shadow of the Gallipoli event, even though the events on the Western Front were so much more significant, so much more massive in numbers. And we'll look at that again in a moment. But Bean said the Anzac achievements on the Western Front were never recognised by Australians back home, even though they were greatly appreciated by the British and the French. Even the German enemy recognised the importance of the Australian efforts on the Western Front. And take a moment to look at these sources. The battle-weary soldiers taking a break, the bombed-out trenches, the street fighting in some of the French and Belgian towns, Australian troops moving up to the frontline trenches across duckboards, the bombed-out landscape full of mud, the cold, difficult, wet, wintry conditions, the evacuation of the wounded by stretcher bearers amongst the rubble, the importance of nurses close to the front line, the so-called bluebirds because of their royal blue uniforms that they wore with the red. And in the bottom right-hand corner, as you look at the screen, you'll be able to see a group of Australians around a bathhouse washing away the lice from their uniform, their clothes. So let's think about how we've remembered the Western Front. Certainly we'll talk more about the Western Front in class, but one of the things that the Sydney Morning Herald has even recognised is that the Western Front has been overshadowed, if you like, by the Anzac experience. And we as historians need to ask, does the Anzac legend in some ways overlook the importance of the Western Front as well? Certainly the Sydney Morning Herald in 1913 on Remembrance Day felt so. Look at these quotes. Anzac achievements on the Western Front were never recognised by Australians back home, even though they were greatly appreciated by those closer to the war, even the Germans. A quote from Bean. The Sydney Morning Herald goes on to say, we as a nation are so transfixed by the Gallipoli event that it's difficult for us to look past that well-intentioned but ineffectual sideshow to the main event, the battles of the Western Front. and that's where the war was actually won. And that's despite the fact that Australians played an enormous role in Belgium and France, where the trenches were Germany's Western Front. Look at the details given here. We might have been defeated and lost about 8,000 lives at Gallipoli. But that debacle was like a drowning man grasping at a straw, and we're clinging onto it as Australians. We constantly focus on the importance of Gallipoli, but the truth is somewhat different, according to the Sydney Morning Herald. The Western Front was at least 5 times larger than Gallipoli. 5 times more Anzacs fought there. They were there 5 times longer, and 5 times more were killed there. They fought in 5 times more battles and won 5 times more Victoria Crosses. So this is a very significant part of the Australian wartime experience. And we need to ask ourselves, is it fully remembered? Or are the Anzac experiences of Gallipoli, which are important, are they more prominent in our national memory? Do we focus on Gallipoli more because of the Anzac legend than we might have focused on the Western Front, which had a greater historical significance? So it's very important that we don't forget the Western Front, that we don't forget the young men who are in this photograph on the screen and the sacrifices they made in our desire to do the right thing, to remember Gallipoli. The Western Front sometimes seems overlooked in the Anzac legend, and we need to be very, very careful about why we use the legend, why the legend is important to Australians, but also the actual history of events and the importance of the contributions of others in other locations besides Gallipoli.